The report was 47 pages long, and it was wrong about everything that mattered. It had charts. It had population demographics broken down by class composition, agricultural versus industrial workers, literacy rates, Communist Party membership in Finnish border regions, estimated loyalty coefficients for the Finnish working class based on economic grievance indices compiled from trade union activity between 1930 and 1938. It had a section on Finnish army equipment that was accurate in every detail. The number of artillery pieces, the vintage of the rifles, the absence of a meaningful armored force, the dependence on a reserve system that drew from a population too small to sustain attrition against Soviet numbers. It had a timeline. 12 days to Helsinki, based on road conditions, Soviet advance rates from previous operations, and the projected rate of Finnish military collapse once the weight of the Red Army made resistance obviously futile. It had everything. It had been produced by the best analytical apparatus the Soviet state could assemble, reviewed by men who had spent careers studying exactly this kind of problem, and delivered to Stalin with the confidence of an institution that had not recently been given reason to doubt its own conclusions. What it did not have was a single page devoted to the question of what a Finnish farmer actually thought about his land. Not abstractly, not ideologically, not in terms of class consciousness or proletarian solidarity or the theoretical trajectory of Finnish capitalism toward its inevitable crisis. What a specific man, in a specific farmhouse, in a specific forest in Karelia or Sala or Suomussalmi, thought about the ground he had cleared and the trees he had cut and the soil he had planted and the cold he had survived for 30 or 40 years in a country that was, by every metric the Soviet analysts had available, objectively poorer and weaker and more vulnerable than the power now moving toward its border. That page did not exist. It had not been written because the analytical framework that produced the 47 pages did not have a category for it. The framework was built on the assumption that human behavior in conditions of extreme material imbalance follows predictable patterns, that populations confronted with overwhelming force make rational calculations about survival, that class interest supersedes national identity when the ideology is correctly explained, that farmers who own small plots of marginal land are, at the level of historical analysis, interchangeable with farmers anywhere else who own small plots of marginal land. The framework was wrong. The war that followed the 47 pages was the proof. But the proof cost 126,000 Soviet dead to produce, and by the time it was complete, the analysts who had written the report had found other things to think about, and the war had ended on terms that allowed the Soviet Union to claim a territorial victory, while declining to examine the analytical failure that had made the victory cost 40 times what the report had projected. This is the story of that failure. It is not a story about military incompetence. It is a story about the specific intellectual error that occurs when a system built to measure things encounters something that cannot be measured with the instruments it has available, and decides that the immeasurability is a property of the thing rather than a limitation of the instrument. The thing that could not be measured was simple. It was the answer to the question the 47 pages never asked. What will these people do when you come for what is theirs? Andrei Zdanov was 50 years old in November 1939 and had been a member of the Politburo since 1939, having climbed through the Soviet Party apparatus with the particular combination of ideological reliability and political survival instinct that the Stalin era selected for with brutal efficiency. He was not a military man. He was a party man, which in the Soviet system of 1939 was a more powerful thing to be, because the party interpreted the analysis that the military then executed, and the interpretation that came from Zdanov's office in the weeks before the Finnish invasion was the interpretation that shaped every operational assumption the Red Army carried across the Finnish border on November 30. Zdanov's analysis rested on 3 pillars, each of which seemed solid from the position of Moscow in October 1939, and each of which collapsed within the first 2 weeks of the campaign with a completeness that should have been catastrophic for the framework that had produced them. The first pillar was class revolt. The Soviet model of historical development held that Finland, like any capitalist state, contained within it a working class whose objective interests were opposed to those of the bourgeois government that ruled them. The Finnish Communist Party existed, had members, had been active in the labor movements of the 1920s and 1930s, and had been suppressed by the Finnish government with the kind of vigor that the Soviet analytical framework interpreted as evidence of a revolutionary situation being kept under pressure. The pressure, in this reading, meant that the arrival of the Red Army would release something that was already waiting to be released. The Finnish working class would welcome liberation. The Finnish army, composed substantially of workers and farmers who had no ideological stake in defending the capitalist order, would collapse or defect under conditions of serious military pressure. The Finnish working class did not revolt. The Finnish army did not collapse or defect. Within 72 hours of the Soviet invasion, the Finnish government had reported mobilization rates that exceeded projections, with reservists reporting to their units in numbers that suggested not the reluctant compliance of men fulfilling a legal obligation, but the active engagement of men who had decided that this particular fight was theirs to join. A Soviet intelligence officer attached to the Leningrad military district, whose assessment reached Zhdanov's office in the second week of December 1939, wrote with the careful phrasing of a man who understood that his report was contradicting analysis that had been endorsed at the highest levels. The anticipated fragmentation of Finnish national unity along class lines has not materialized. The population appears to be responding to the military situation with a degree of cohesion that was not predicted by pre-campaign assessments. The reasons for this cohesion are not fully understood. The reasons were not fully understood because the analytical framework did not have the conceptual vocabulary to describe them. What was happening in Finland in December 1939 was not ideologically complex. It was the oldest and simplest human response to the arrival of a foreign army on familiar ground. The Finns were defending their homes, not their government, not their economic system, not an abstract principle of national sovereignty. Their specific, physical, known homes. The farm that had been in a family for 3 generations. The forest where a man had learned to hunt before he learned to read. The lake that froze every November and stayed frozen until April and whose ice a family knew by sound and by flex, and by the particular creaking it made at the edges when the temperature shifted. The Soviet analytical framework had no measurement for this. It had measurements for everything else. It had the number of farms and their acreage, and their productivity, and the debt levels of their owners and the theoretical surplus value extracted from agricultural labor in the Finnish economy. It did not have a number for what a man who has spent 40 winters learning a specific piece of ground will do when told to leave it. The second pillar of Zhdanov's analysis was military incapacity. This pillar was, in its material claims, largely accurate. The Finnish army in November 1939 was genuinely limited. Its artillery was insufficient for sustained combined arms operations at scale. Its anti-tank capability was, at the outset of the campaign, almost non-existent in any conventional sense. Its air force was negligible against Soviet air power. Its numbers were small. The reserve system that formed the bulk of its fighting strength was composed of men who were farmers and woodcutters and mechanics and postmen in their civilian lives, who trained for limited periods each year, who carried rifles that were old by the standards of modern industrial warfare. On paper, these deficiencies were decisive. In the forest, at -35 degrees, in December darkness, against an army that could not leave the roads, these deficiencies were largely irrelevant. This is the point at which the 47 pages committed its most fundamental error, and it is an error that is worth examining in detail because it appears, in various forms, in every analytical failure of this type across every domain where analysis has been applied to complex real-world problems. The report measured Finnish military capacity in absolute terms. It counted the artillery pieces and found them insufficient. It counted the tanks and found them absent. It counted the men and found them too few. What it did not do was ask the question that would have produced a different analysis entirely. Insufficient, absent, and too few for what, exactly? For a conventional force-on-force engagement on open terrain against a mechanized opponent. Yes, clearly. For a defensive campaign in boreal forest in winter against a mechanized opponent that could not maneuver off the road network. The 47 pages had no answer to this question because it had not asked it. The terrain was not in the spreadsheet. Not the actual terrain, the terrain as a military fact rather than a geographical notation. The forests of Finland appear in the Soviet operational maps as features to be navigated around, not as active participants in the military balance. The road network appears as a logistical asset. The lakes appear as obstacles. The cold appears as a weather condition to be managed with appropriate clothing and equipment. None of these appearances were accurate. The forests were not navigable around because the forests were everywhere and the roads ran through them. The road network was not a logistical asset. It was a constraint that turned every Soviet column into a linear target. The lakes were not obstacles. They were highways for Finnish ski troops moving across terrain that stopped Soviet infantry. The cold was not a weather condition to be managed. It was an ally of the side whose soldiers had spent their lives in it, and an executioner of the side whose soldiers had not. These were not facts that required classified intelligence to discover. They were facts about Finland that anyone who had spent time in Finland in December could have provided. They were facts that appeared, in various forms, in the geographical and meteorological data available to Soviet analysts before the campaign began. The problem was not that the information was absent. The problem was that the analytical framework did not know what to do with it, because the framework was built to process military variables, and the Finnish winter was not, in the framework's categories, a military variable. It was a fact about Finland. Facts about Finland that did not translate into military variables were noted and filed, and not incorporated into the projections. This is the specific intellectual pathology at the center of the Soviet analytical failure. Not stupidity, not ignorance, but the systematic exclusion of information that does not fit the measurement categories the framework was built to use. The framework could measure tanks. It could not measure what happens to tanks on a single-lane road in a forest at -35 degrees when the men in them have never experienced that cold and have no white camouflage and cannot see anything past the tree line. So it measured the tanks and produced a number, and the number was correct, and the conclusion drawn from the number was catastrophically wrong. The third pillar was timeline. 12 days. This figure had a precision that suggested calculation and concealed assumption. The calculation was based on Soviet advance rates from previous operations, Finnish road conditions, the projected rate of Finnish military collapse, and the logistical requirements of sustaining a force of this size in the field for the duration required. Every input to this calculation was wrong in the same direction. Soviet advance rates from previous operations had been achieved against opponents who did not have the Finnish forest as an ally, and did not have the Finnish winter as a weapon, and did not have the specific, intimate, generational knowledge of their own terrain that Finnish soldiers possessed. Finnish road conditions appeared on maps in ways that did not communicate what it meant to move a motorized column through those roads in December. The projected rate of Finnish military collapse was based on the first pillar, which had assumed that class revolt would accelerate the collapse beyond what purely military pressure would produce. The logistical requirements were calculated for a 12-day campaign and were therefore catastrophically insufficient for the campaign that actually occurred. The logistics that had been calculated for 12 days were spent in the first 3 weeks, after which the Soviet forces in the most exposed positions began to experience the specific form of military incapacity that occurs when a modern army runs out of the supplies that make it a modern army and is left with men and weapons in a Finnish forest in January. The men and weapons in a Finnish forest in January, without resupply, without adequate winter clothing, without the ability to leave the roads that had become both their position and their liability, were not a modern army. They were a collection of human beings in the wrong place in the wrong season with the wrong equipment and the wrong analytical framework for understanding what was happening to them. A report filed by the political commissar of the 44th Division in late December 1939, recovered in Finnish intelligence archives, contains a passage that is, in its way, the most precise possible measurement of the distance between Zdanov's 47 pages and the reality those pages had failed to describe. The commissar wrote, "We were told the Finnish workers would greet us. We have been here for 3 weeks and we have not been greeted. We have been shot at from trees we cannot see into, by men we cannot find, using terrain we cannot navigate, in cold that our equipment was not designed for. The men I am responsible for maintaining ideologically are not asking questions about Finnish class structure. They are asking whether they will be alive in the morning. I do not have a political education response to that question. He was describing, with the precision of a man whose job required him to maintain a theoretical framework in contact with an experience that was destroying the framework, the fundamental problem with the 47 pages. The theoretical framework had produced a prediction. The prediction had been wrong. The experience of the wrongness was now something that the theoretical framework, designed for analysis rather than survival, had no response to. The men in the forest did not need analysis. They needed white camouflage and skis, and the kind of knowledge of the terrain that takes a lifetime to acquire and cannot be issued from a supply depot in Leningrad 3 weeks into a campaign that was supposed to have ended before it required any of those things. They did not have white camouflage. They did not have skis in sufficient quantity or with men capable of using them at combat effectiveness. They did not have knowledge of the terrain. They had a report that said they would not need these things because the campaign would be over before the absence of these things became relevant. The campaign was not over. The absence of these things was relevant, and the 47 pages were in a file in Moscow, while the men who had been sent to execute its projections were dying in Finnish snow at rates that the projections had not considered possible. What the Finnish farmers and woodcutters and mechanics who composed the Finnish army's reserve forces had that the Soviet analytical framework could not measure was this: they knew exactly what they were defending and exactly why it mattered to them, and this knowledge produced a quality of motivation that does not appear in any military balance spreadsheet, but that has determined the outcome of conflicts since before there were spreadsheets to exclude it from. A Finnish reservist named Paavo Heikkinen, a farmer from North Karelia who had served in the Winter War and survived it, gave an interview in 1971 to a Finnish oral history project that was collecting veteran testimony. He was asked what he had thought about when he received his mobilization order in November 1939. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about the field behind the house," he said. "The East Field. It takes 3 days to clear in spring because of the stones. My grandfather cleared it. My father cleared it. I cleared it every spring. I thought, I am not giving that field to anyone." He was asked whether he had thought about Finland as a country, about national sovereignty, about the political situation. "Later, maybe," he said. "At first I thought about the field. The East Field with the stones. Years bakermaking you are at the sign. Seamer or Morse. This is the information that was not in the 47 pages. Not this specific man and this specific field, but the category of thing that this man and this field represent, the concrete, physical, personal relationship between a person and the land they have worked, that no ideological analysis of class interest can adequately predict or account for, because it operates at a level of human motivation that precedes ideology and survives it, and is, in the specific circumstances of a defensive war fought on known ground against a foreign invader, more powerful than any material imbalance that a spreadsheet can document." The Soviet framework said, "These are farmers with old rifles facing the largest land army in the world." Conclusion: they will calculate the odds and either surrender or defect. The farmers said, "This is our field with the stones that we cleared in spring." Conclusion: we are not leaving. Both statements were, within their own logical systems, entirely coherent. The problem was that only one of them was about what was actually happening. The aftermath of the analytical failure was managed in the way that Soviet institutions managed failures that implicated the analytical framework itself rather than the individuals operating within it. The individuals were blamed. Meretskov was replaced by Timoshenko. Various commanders were court-martialed or shot. The tactical failures were attributed to the incompetence of specific officers rather than to the systemic failure of the analytical model that had sent those officers into the Finnish forest with projections that bore no relationship to what they found there. The model was not examined. The 47 pages were not revisited in any official capacity. The lessons that should have been extracted from the catastrophic gap between the projections and the reality were partially absorbed at the tactical level. where the reorganization under Timoshenko produced the grinding, methodical, expensive offensive that eventually broke Finnish resistance through sheer weight. But at the analytical level, the level where Zhdanov's report had been produced and endorsed, and used to justify a campaign that killed 126,000 Soviet soldiers, the examination did not occur. It could not occur, because the examination would have required acknowledging that the framework itself was flawed, and the framework was not a military artifact that could be court-martialed or replaced. It was an epistemological commitment, a way of understanding how the world worked that was embedded in the ideological structure of the Soviet state at a level that military reform could not reach. The framework said, history is determined by material forces, and material forces can be measured, and measurement produces reliable prediction. Finland had disproved this in 105 days at the cost of 126,000 dead, and the framework survived the disproof intact because the alternative, acknowledging that there are things the framework cannot measure that determine outcomes the framework cannot measure that determine outcomes the framework cannot predict, was institutionally unavailable. The farmers went back to their fields. The stones were still there in spring, the same stones that had always been there, and the clearing took 3 days as it always had, and the field was theirs as it had always been, and the 47 pages were in a file in Moscow, and the war was over, and the field with the stones was not in that file, and had never been in that file, and was the reason, more than any other single reason, that the file had been wrong. There is a version of this failure that occurs in every domain where analysis has been substituted for understanding. The analyst who has access to every measurable variable and no access to the variable that determines the outcome. The projection that is internally consistent and externally useless. The confidence that comes from a framework so complete that the things it cannot measure become invisible, not because they are absent but because the framework has no space for them. The question the 47 pages never asked is the question that every analysis of human behavior in conditions of extreme pressure must ask before it asks anything else. What will these people do when you come for what is theirs? Not what does history suggest they will do. Not what does ideology predict they will do. Not what does the material balance of forces indicate they should rationally do. What will they actually do, these specific people, with this specific relationship to this specific ground, when the thing they have spent their lives building and working and clearing and defending is threatened by something larger and more powerful than themselves? The answer is not always the same. Sometimes people calculate the odds and surrender. Sometimes people calculate the odds and fight anyway, not because the calculation comes out in favor of fighting, but because there are things that the calculation does not include, things that live in the east field with the stones, in the forest where a man learned to hunt before he learned to read, in the specific cold of a specific winter in a specific place that is not merely a place on a map, but a place in a life. The Soviet framework could not see those things. It looked at Finland and saw variables. The variables were measured and the measurement produced a projection, and the projection was wrong, and 126,000 men died in the gap between the projection and the reality. The field with the stones could not be put in a spreadsheet. The farmer who would not leave it could not be predicted by a model built on class analysis and material balance. The forest that those farmers knew and the Soviet army did not know could not be adequately represented on a map that showed it only as terrain rather than as terrain that one side understood and the other did not. The map that cannot show what people will die for is not a map of the war. It is a map of the analyst's assumptions, and assumptions do not stop bullets.